In 1956, two scientists stood before the American Geophysical Union in Toronto and presented a discovery that would reshape how we understand the planet. A rift valley, a continuous crack splitting the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, evidence that the Earth's crust is pulling apart, evidence that the continents move. The paper carried two names, Ewing-Heezen and Maurice Ewing. The person who actually identified the rift in the data was not on the stage, was not on the paper, was not, according to institutional policy, permitted on the ships that collected the data. Her name was Marie Tharp, and for the better part of 3 decades, the story of how the ocean floor was mapped was told without her in it. To understand how that happened, start in Ypsilanti, Michigan, 1920. Marie Tharp was born the only child of Bertha Louise Tharp, a German and Latin teacher, and William Edgar Tharp, a soil surveyor for the United States Department of Agriculture. William Tharp's job took the family across the country: Alabama, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, New York, Washington, D.C. Marie attended nearly 24 different schools before finishing high school. She never stayed anywhere long enough to make lasting friends. But she did something else. She followed her father into the field. She watched him measure land, collect samples, draw maps for farmers. Map-making got into her early. Her father's advice, which she repeated decades later, was simple. Find something you can do, something you like, and do that. After her father retired, the family settled on a farm in Bellefontaine, Ohio. Marie's mother died shortly after. Marie was about 15. She graduated high school, took a year off to help her father with the farm, then enrolled at Ohio University in 1939. She had no direction, changed her major every semester: English, music, art, education, philosophy. She graduated in 1943 with degrees in English and music, 4 minors, and no clear idea of what to do next. For a woman in 1943, the options were narrow: teacher, secretary, nurse, librarian. Science was not on the list. And then Pearl Harbor changed the arithmetic. With men leaving universities for the front lines, the University of Michigan did something it had never done before. It opened its geology department to women. The program was blunt about its purpose: train women to fill the petroleum industry jobs that men had vacated. The recruits were called PG girls, Petroleum Geology Girls. A brochure promising a guaranteed job landed on Tharp's desk, and she jumped at it. She earned her master's in geology in 1944, spent her summers doing field work out west, and for the first time felt like she had found the thing her father was talking about. She later said she never would have gotten the chance to study geology if it hadn't been for Pearl Harbor. The door opened because a war killed enough men to make room. After graduation, she took a job at Stanalind Oil and Gas Company in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Within weeks, she discovered a familiar problem. Women were not permitted to do field work. Tharp was confined to an office, coordinating maps and data for the men who went into the field. 4 years of that. While stuck at her desk, she enrolled at the University of Tulsa and picked up a second bachelor's degree, this time in mathematics. By 1948, she had 2 bachelor's degrees, a master's in geology, a degree in math, and the clear sense that Oklahoma had nothing left to offer her. She moved to New York, looked for work at the American Museum of Natural History first, but decided against it after a paleontologist told her it took 2 years to separate a single fossil from rock. She tried Columbia University instead. There she found Maurice Ewing, a physicist and geologist who had founded the Lamont Geological Observatory, which would become one of the most important earth science institutions in the world. Ewing hired her as a drafter. Tharp was one of the first women to work at Lamont. The detail that often gets skipped: when Tharp interviewed for the job, she did not mention her master's degree in geology. Whether she thought it would help or hurt is unclear, but the fact that she considered hiding it says something about the environment she was walking into. 2 weeks after Tharp arrived, a graduate student from Iowa named Ewing-Heezen showed up. He was 24, ambitious, and already obsessed with the ocean. Ewing had recruited him after a lecture tour with a line that sounded almost casual. Would he like to go on an expedition to the mid-Atlantic ridge? There were some mountains there, and they didn't know which way they ran. Heezen signed on. He would spend the next 3 decades crisscrossing the ocean, and Tharp would spend most of those decades in a room at Lamont, turning his data into something nobody had ever seen before. Their first project together was mundane, using photographic data to locate downed military aircraft from World War II. Eventually, Heezen kept Tharp so busy that she ended up working exclusively for him. After about 3 years of routine calculations and drafting for various researchers, she nearly quit. Whether it was overwork or frustration at being stuck on other people's projects is not entirely clear. But she came back, and the project that brought her back changed the history of Earth science. Here's what the job looked like. Heezen sailed on the research vessel Vima, dragging echo sounders across the Atlantic. The sounders worked by sending a pulse of sound, an electronic ping, straight down to the ocean floor and recording the time it took for the echo to come back. That return time told you the depth. The output was a continuous line burned onto 4-inch wide strips of paper by an electric stylus. Thousands of feet of paper per voyage. Thousands of data points, each representing one spot on the floor of the ocean. That paper came back to Lamont on great rolls, and it landed on Marie Tharp's desk. Her task: take those undulating lines from dozens of separate voyages traveling in different directions, align them by latitude and longitude, and piece together a coherent picture of what was down there. Nobody had done this before. Not systematically. Not for an entire ocean basin. The assumption at the time, held by nearly everyone in the field, was that the ocean floor was essentially flat, a giant featureless basin filled with sediment, like the bottom of an enormous bathtub. Tharp was about to prove that assumption spectacularly wrong. By 1952, she had assembled roughly half a dozen east-to-west profiles across the North Atlantic. Weeks of plotting, aligning snippets from different ships, different cruises, different years, Nova Scotia to France, Massachusetts to the Strait of Gibraltar. The result, as she later described it, looked like a spider's web, with lines resembling telephone wires spanning the Atlantic. And then she noticed something. Each profile had a consistent dip, a V-shaped notch at the same spot, right at the crest of an underwater mountain chain called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The notch appeared in profile after profile. Same position, same shape, same depth. To Tharp, it looked like a rift valley, a crack where the Earth's crust was being pulled apart from below. If material was being forced up from deep inside the Earth, it would split the ridge in two and push the sides apart. And if that was happening at the bottom of the Atlantic, it meant the continents on either side were moving away from each other, which meant Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, ridiculed for decades, might actually be right. This was not a safe conclusion to reach in 1952. Continental drift was close to scientific heresy. Wegener, a German meteorologist, had proposed the idea in 1912 and been mocked for it. The geological establishment, especially in the United States, had rejected the theory so thoroughly that the word for its supporters, drifters, was an insult. At Lamont, under Ewing, and across most American geology departments, backing continental drift could end a career. Being a drifter could get you fired, Tharp's own words. So when she showed Heezen her profiles and explained what she thought the V-shaped notch meant, his reaction was immediate and dismissive. He told her it couldn't be. It looked too much like continental drift. And then he used a phrase that would follow this story for the next 70 years. He called her interpretation girl talk. And he made her redo all the charts. That phrase deserves more than a footnote. Not because it was unusual for the era, it was not, but because of what it reveals about the power structure of mid-century science. Tharp had a master's in geology and a degree in mathematics. She was, by several measures, more formally educated than Heezen at the time. She had spent weeks inside the data. She knew those profiles better than anyone alive. And the response was not, "Show me your reasoning," or "Let's test this against other data." The response was dismissal based on who she was, not what she found. Redo it. So she redid it. The notch was still there. Tharp didn't argue. She didn't escalate. She went back to the data, requested more profiles from other institutions, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's vessel Atlantis, naval surveys, anything she could access, and kept plotting. The V-shaped notch appeared in every new profile. Same position, same depth. Meanwhile, a few desks away, something unrelated was happening that would change everything. Heezen had hired a recent graduate named Howard Foster to work on a separate project entirely, mapping the locations of undersea earthquake epicenters for Bell Laboratories, which needed to know where to lay transatlantic telephone cables without them being destroyed by seismic activity. Foster was plotting tens of thousands of earthquake locations onto a map at the same scale as Tharp's ocean floor profiles. Two separate projects, two separate desks, two data sets that nobody expected to have anything to do with each other. When Foster's earthquake map was overlaid with Tharp's profiles, the result was impossible to ignore. The earthquake epicenters fell directly into the Rift Valley. Not close, not roughly aligned, directly on it. The earthquakes were happening precisely along the line where Tharp said the crust was splitting apart. Two independent data sets, collected for entirely different purposes, pointing to the same conclusion. The rift was real, and it was active. This was the moment where the evidence became too heavy for any phrase to hold back. Tharp pushed further. Using seismographic data from other oceans, she extended the rift beyond the North Atlantic, south through the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden. The rift connected to the East African Rift Valley on land, a single continuous fracture running more than 40,000 miles around the planet. What Heezen would later call a monstrous scar splitting the globe into pieces, the largest physical feature on Earth. and Marie Tharp had found it by sitting in a room with a pen, a ruler, and rolls of paper that nobody else had the patience or the skill to interpret at that scale. Now here's where the story adds a layer that most versions leave out. The depth data Tharp was working with, collected by Navy-funded research vessels during the Cold War, was classified. The logic was straightforward. Soviet submarines could use ocean floor maps to hide or to navigate. Detailed contour maps showing exact depths were restricted material. Publishing them was not an option. So Tharp and Heezen made a decision that turned out to be both practical and brilliant. Instead of standard topographic maps with contour lines, they created what are called physiographic diagrams, a technique borrowed from the Columbia geomorphologist A.K. Lobeck. Physiographic maps show terrain the way it would look from a low-flying airplane. Mountains look like mountains. Valleys look like valleys. Ridges look like ridges. No classified depth numbers, no contour lines, just a picture of the shape of the ocean floor, drawn by hand, with shading and perspective that made the invisible visible. It was, in Tharp's own assessment, a way to publish their data without publishing their data. Anyone, scientists, school children, members of Congress, could look at the map and immediately understand that the bottom of the ocean was not a bathtub. It was a landscape as dramatic as anything on the surface. This was entirely Tharp's domain. The artistic interpretation, the geological intuition needed to fill in the gaps between ship tracks where no data existed, the shading that gave each ridge its texture and each plane its smoothness. That required her specific combination of training in geology, mathematics, and drafting. Where the ships hadn't sailed, she extrapolated based on her knowledge of how geology works on land. She later joked that she wanted to include mermaids and shipwrecks in the blank spots. Heezen would not allow it. Heezen eventually came around on the Rift Valley. It took months. Some accounts say closer to a year. The earthquake data was impossible to dismiss. He accepted that Tharp was right. And then, in 1956, he and Maurice Ewing presented the findings at the American Geophysical Union meeting in Toronto. They announced the discovery of a global mid-ocean ridge system with a seismically active rift at its center, one of the most significant findings in the history of Earth science. The paper bore two names, Heezen and Ewing. Tharp was not credited. 4 years after she had discovered the worldwide rift, the paper that announced it to the scientific community did not contain her name. The person who identified the rift in the data, who spent years plotting it by hand while barred from the ships that collected it, who was told her interpretation was girl talk and proved it right anyway. That person was absent from the record. Worth pausing on the mechanics of this. It was not a secret that Tharp had done the work. People at Lamont knew. Heezen knew. Ewing knew. The decision to leave her off the paper was not a conspiracy. It was simply how things worked. She was a research assistant on fixed-term contracts. She did not have tenure. She did not have a permanent position. She was employed as a technician, not a scientist, despite holding more formal qualifications than some of the scientists she supported. The work she produced belonged to the project, and the project belonged to the men whose names were on the grants. This was not unusual. It was the system, and the system was efficient at one thing above all: making certain people disappear from their own discoveries. The following year, 1957, Heezen gave a lecture at Princeton University. He brought a globe that Tharp had constructed, showing the rift system encircling the entire planet. After the talk, the geologist Harry Hess stood up and said something that became one of the most repeated lines in the history of geology. He told the young man that he had shaken the foundations of the field. Hess would go on to develop the theory of seafloor spreading, directly building on the rift data that Tharp had plotted. The compliment, the credit, and the historical narrative all pointed in one direction, toward Heezen. The globe he carried was built by Tharp. The data he presented was plotted by Tharp. The rift he described was discovered by Tharp. The foundations that were shaken by her work. But Hess addressed the young man, and the quote stayed that way. There is an aside here that deserves its own space. Jacques Cousteau, already the most famous undersea explorer alive, was skeptical of the rift. More than skeptical. He hung a copy of the Tharp-Heezen map in the mess hall of his ship, the Calypso, and set out to disprove it. He lowered an underwater camera into the Atlantic, directly over the spot where Tharp's maps indicated the valley should be. The plan was to film a flat, featureless ocean floor and put the entire rift theory to rest. The footage he brought back showed the rift valley in sharp, undeniable detail. Exactly where Tharp had drawn it. Exactly the shape she had predicted. Cousteau presented the film at the 1959 International Oceanographic Conference. The room saw, on screen, what Tharp had seen in sonar traces years earlier. A man set out to disprove a woman's work and accidentally became one of the strongest pieces of evidence for it. Tharp, for context, was not a presenter at that conference. She later said that the footage helped convince a lot of people to believe in the Rift Valley. The sentence carries more patience than most people would manage. Things got worse before they got better. In the early 1960s, the long deteriorating relationship between Ewing and Heezen, fueled by disputes over credit, publication priority, and scientific direction, collapsed entirely. Ewing cut off Heezen's access to Lamont data and banned him from the observatory's research ships. And then he fired Tharp. Not Heezen. Heezen had tenure. Tharp had never held anything but fixed-term contracts. Her entire career at Lamont, over 15 years of work, had been a series of temporary appointments, one after another, with no security and no institutional protection. When the politics between two powerful men detonated, she was the one who lost her office. She lost her access. She lost her place at the institution where she had done the most important work of her career. She moved a drafting table to her home in South Nyack, New York, a small house overlooking the Hudson River. And she kept working. Heezen, who still held his Columbia position, secured funding through Navy grants and other sources, and channeled work and money to Tharp. For the next 13 years, from the mid-1960s to 1977, the mapping of the world's ocean floors continued, not from a laboratory at one of the world's leading universities, but from a house in a small river town. Tharp, working with assistants funded through Heezen's grants, continued plotting profiles, extending maps into every ocean basin on Earth. The arrangement was functional. It was also absurd. One of the most important cartographic projects of the 20th century, funded by the United States Navy, executed in someone's living room because the cartographer had been fired for being the wrong person in the wrong political feud. One positive consequence of Ewing's ban, with Heezen no longer allowed on Lamont's ships, He began organizing cruises through other institutions, and for the first time, in 1968, 20 years after she started mapping the ocean floor, Marie Tharp was permitted to go to sea. In the early 70s, Heezen and Tharp received a Navy grant to collaborate with the Austrian landscape painter Heinrich Behren on something unprecedented: a complete painted panorama of the entire world's ocean floor. Behren was famous for his alpine mountain panoramas, sweeping, almost three-dimensional painted views that made you feel like you were flying over the landscape. Tharp and Heezen supplied the scientific data. Behren translated it into art. The project took 4 years. The result, the World Ocean Floor Map, was finished in 1977. National Geographic published it. The map measured roughly 42 by 72 inches. Only one printer in the United States could produce it, at a cost of about $40,000 per copy. It was, and remains, one of the most recognized scientific maps ever created. It hangs on university walls around the world. It showed every ridge, every trench, every mountain range beneath the oceans, in a style that made the planet's largest hidden landscape visible to anyone who looked at it. The map carried 2 names, Heezen and Tharp, both names. Finally, side by side. Bruce Heezen did not live to see the final printed version. On June 21, 1977, he suffered a heart attack aboard the Navy submarine NR-1 while studying the mid-Atlantic ridge near Iceland, the same feature Tharp had first identified in her profiles 25 years earlier. He was 53 years old. His death left Tharp without her collaborator of 3 decades, without her primary source of funding, and without a clear institutional home. Organizations that had contracted both of them reassigned their projects. Tharp stayed on at Columbia until 1983, then retired. She operated a map distribution business from her house in South Nyack, selling copies of the maps from the same rooms where she had drawn them. Recognition came late, and it came quietly. In 1978, Tharp and Heezen posthumously received the Hubbard Medal, the National Geographic Society's highest honor. In 1995, Tharp donated her entire collection of maps, research notes, and correspondence to the Library of Congress, tens of thousands of items from 30 years of work. 2 years later, they named her one of the 4 greatest cartographers of the 20th century. In 1999, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution gave her the Mary Sears Woman Pioneer in Oceanography Award. In 2001, Columbia awarded her the first Lamont Doherty Heritage Award. She was 81 years old. Fixed-term contracts for her entire career, fired from her own laboratory, working from her living room for 13 years, and then, at 81, a Heritage Award from the institution that had let her go. Marie Tharp died of cancer on August 23, 2006, in Nyack, New York. She was 86. In 2023, the United States Navy named a survey vessel after her, USNS Marie Tharp. The ship's job is to map the ocean floor. The 1956 paper that announced the Rift Valley to the world is still cited in geology textbooks. It still carries 2 names, Heezen and Ewing. The person who found the rift, who plotted it by hand across 40,000 miles of ocean floor, who was dismissed as girl talk and proved right by a man who sailed out to prove her wrong. That person is not on the paper. The Library of Congress corrected the record. The Navy corrected the record. The European Geosciences Union named their tectonics medal after her. But the original document, the first announcement of one of the most important discoveries in Earth science, that stays the way it was written. 2 names, neither of them hers. That's the buried record. And until very recently, almost nobody thought to check. Next time, a different kind of descent. January 1960. 2 men climb into a steel sphere the size of a closet and drop toward the deepest point on Earth. At 9,000 meters, the viewport cracks. They keep going. That story is coming.